Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you. I think we were supposed to start at 2:30, right? So we're going to go ahead and get started because for those that know me, know I can talk, and I want you guys to be able to get through the presentation, give you the ability to ask any questions that you may have, because we've got a lot of changes coming up in the next several months in the state of Florida. And so we want to make sure that everyone is aware of those changes moving forward. First and foremost, I'm Courtney Smith from the Office of Child Welfare with the Department of Children and Families. I am the Adoption and Permanency Manager, so I oversee the specialists that write policy for adoptions in conjunction with our Title IV-E eligibility, foster home licensing, I'm trying to think of a Guardianship Assistance Program, the new program we're going to talk about. And then I was the manager that did a lot of work in our Path Forward initiative. So the initiation and implementation of the extension of foster care program, which we'll talk about as well. Can everybody hear me? Because I feel like I'm real low, but I'm okay. I'm very down to earth, and so if you can't hear me, if you need me to repeat something, please just say, hey, Courtney, I didn't understand, didn't repeat, we'll go over that again, not a problem. And in addition, I always tell folks, I feed off of you, right? And so if I'm getting the looks of, oh, that sounds good, even the looks of, well, why are we doing that, right? That doesn't even make sense, or I don't like that at all. I get that you understand, right? But if I get those stared looks like, I have no idea what this young lady is talking about, I'll keep probing, asking questions maybe of the audience to make sure that we're all on the same page. Because the importance here is that this group, our guardian ad litems across the state, be able to take back the information that we're getting ready to share, because most important is that the information that we provide statewide is accurate. Right? We're launching a new program, and we want to make sure that everyone across the state is on the same page in regards to eligibility criteria, benefits, who is eligible, when they're eligible, how they become eligible, so that we send a clear message not only to our internal child welfare professionals, such as you guys, CLS, our case managers, our PIs, but our caregivers, right? Because this program is truly intended to provide a higher level of support to our relatives, non-relatives, and fictive kin, okay? So we will go ahead and get started. So I used my clicker, and I have been having issues with it, and it does not want to work this far away. Let's see. And it was working earlier. I think I may have to stay close. Okay. All right. So I always start off with why this, why now? How many folks have heard about the Title IV-E waiver, right? Okay. How many folks know what the Title IV-E waiver does? Okay, so it's a buzzword that's going around, and so a lot of the changes we are making are because of the Title IV-E demonstration waiver. And so I always start out with a little bit of education on what the waiver did and allowed us to do, so everyone can understand the importance of where we are going and what type of environment we will be in coming very soon the end of this year. So the Title IV-E demonstration waiver, so currently right now we are on a Title IV-E demonstration waiver. We've been on that waiver for over 10 years, so it's been our way of life, it's what we all know. But it allowed us to do two things. First and foremost, it allowed us to waive certain provisions of the Title IV-E Act in order to still claim $40, right? And so long story short, I tell everyone that it allowed us to waive items that we were supposed to check off to ensure that a child met compliance to pull down $40 for that child. And so for the past 10 years, we've had the ability not to check those items off federally, but waive some of those standards in order to still claim that money. And so what happens when someone gives you tons and tons of money, right? But they never come back to check to ensure that you're doing all of the requirements that you were supposed to be doing? you stop doing some of the requirements, right? And so we've noticed and we found out in the state of Florida that some of our Title IV-E requirements, while there was always provisions that we ensured that we had that documentation and that data, because of different things that were going on in the state, right? We had other competing priorities. Some of those items fell behind, and we did not complete them all as we should have been during the actual waiver. But because we were on the waiver, the federal government gave us a pass in allowing us to still claim Title IV-E money. Once the waiver ends, that pass goes away, right? We will only be able to claim money for those children who are truly Title IV-E eligible in order to provide them maintenance, foster care board payments. In addition, provide admin expenses for staff across the state, all right? So the second thing that the Title IV-E demonstration waiver allowed us to do is probably one of the bigger items. Most states picked a singular program to fund with Title IV-E money. We actually had another state submit a proposal to our Child Protection Summit about their foster care recruitment IV-E program. So that state poured all of their IV-E money into one program, and so when the IV-E waiver ends for that state, they'll just end the program. Well, we're a little different in the state of Florida, right? We always got to do something cutting edge, which just makes us one of the greatest states out there. We decided to fund our community-based care agencies, right? There's no way you can just turn them off. They are the base foundation of our child welfare system. We decided to fund services to children. We decided to fund services to families. And when the waiver ends, the way we spend our IV-E money will have to change, okay? We will only be allowed, there are a couple of other expenses, like expenses for children's legal services, but the bulk of the money will have to go towards admin expenses for staff, but in addition, our payments for care of our children in out-of-home care, so our foster care maintenance payments, okay? And because of how the federal government allows you to spend money and how we're going to have to shift how we spend money, this is, okay? We're expected to lose that second bullet, $90 million in revenue to our CBCs. Right, a lot of money, okay? The waiver is actually set to expire in September of this year. It was actually going to expire last year, 2018 September, but we asked for an extension. That extension was granted, and so we are expected to expire on the waiver September of this year. And when we do that, if we claim all of our IV-E properly, we're pulling down as much money as we have, just because the way the federal government allows us to spend IV-E dollars, we will lose 90 million. It's estimated. Sometimes I've heard a little bit more, sometimes I've heard a little bit less, but the middle ground is an estimate of $90 million. And so once again, think about that. $90 million in services to our families, which includes services to our children, our parents, among other things, okay? And so the department, along with the FCC, got together and said, hey, we've got to figure out a strategic plan in order to ensure that, one, we continue to provide the highest level of care to our families, or increase the care and benefits that we're providing to our families. But we've also got to financially figure out how do we maintain our current level of services, knowing that we're going to lose that $90 million, right? And so we got together, and so for the past 2 years, we've been working on the Path Forward Initiative, okay? The Path Forward Initiative is truly the department, the FCC, the child welfare system of care's plan for how do we transition to a non-waiver environment, right? For those that have been around 10 plus years doing the child welfare work, it was very different, right? It was very different from what we know and what we were allowed to do. And so how do we make that transition? Yes, ma'am, a question in the back. No, so the way we're spending it now, they don't allow you to spend it that way when you're off the waiver. So the waiver, so Title IV-E money has certain specific areas where you can spend it on, period. There's no asking to change it. They give you a bucket of this is what you can spend money on. And so the way we've been spending it, because we were on the waiver, is outside of that bucket. Once we go on the waiver, we have to, once we go off the waiver, we have to start spending our money the way that they've aligned it in that bucket, right? So they said we have to spend it the way so they said, the federal government, is you have to spend it the way we say spend it. And so when we do that, the way we spend 4E money is going to cause us to lose $90 million, right? And so we had to figure out how could we come up with that $90 million deficit, right, that we're going to incur in services to families, but at the same time, one, keep at minimum the same level of benefits, services we provided to families, but be strategic about when we have opportunities to enhance our level of services to families and children in our care, taking advantage of it, okay? And so that's what the Path Forward Initiative does. So there are a couple of programs in the Path Forward Initiative. First and foremost, you guys, how many have heard about Extension of Foster Care Program? Cal? We've got some of our CBC Extension of Foster Care staff with us today. Thank you for coming. An Extension of Maintenance Adoption Subsidy, okay? And so these two programs went live in January, and I know you're thinking, well, Courtney, we've always had an extension of foster care program. That's not new, right? We've had that for the past couple of years. We've had a state-funded extension of foster care program, okay? That program put our CBCs in a deficit every year, and I have a quick slide that I'll show you next, of about $11 million, because we were taking state revenue to fund those services for those children. What we did in January is that we took our state program and we made it a Title IV program, where that now we fit the bucket to pull down 4E money, right, for this program, and we are able to provide the same level of services and benefits to our children in our EFC program, okay? So you probably have seen some changes across the state when it comes to EFC. Prior to us going live and being a state program, each CBC really had the ability to kind of shape their program based off of their community. While that is still true, because we are a federal program, there are federal components that we have to meet and ensure that are completed the same way across the state. So you'll see for EFC a lot of standardization of forms. So forms that they complete, they look the same across the state. Assessments should be the same across the state. Time frames were added so that we could ensure that our process for our children in extension of foster care was the same from Tallahassee to Miami, okay? With going live with the extension of Title IVE, one of the requirements in doing that was that if you had a 4E adoption program, we've had a 4E adoption program for as long as I can remember, for years and years and years. If you had a 4E adoption program, you had to extend that program to individuals who signed their adoption assistance agreement when the child they were adopting was 16 or 17 until the age of 21. So I always tell my adoption folks, thank EFC every day, because it allowed us to provide an enhanced benefit to our families who, once again, signed their adoption assistance agreement when the child is 16 or 17, okay? I always want to point out on the extension of maintenance adoption subsidy that in order to be eligible, it's not about when the child is adopted. So if you've got a kid who is adopted at age 16, they are not eligible for, 15, I'm sorry. If you have a kid who is adopted at age 15, they are not eligible for the adoption assistance extended, okay? It has to be that when they were 16, they signed their agreement. So if Susie, who was 15, let's say signed her adoption assistance agreement with her adopted family at age 15, and then still was adopted at age 16, the child still would not be eligible, because it's all about when that initial agreement is signed. In order to be eligible for the extension of maintenance adoption subsidy, you have to be in a qualifying activity as well when you turn 18. and to be continuously eligible, you have to stay in a qualifying activity. Those qualifying activities are the same ones you have for EFC. Okay, those are federal requirements in order to be in those programs. So we launched those 2 programs in January. We will talk about the Guardianship Assistance Program and EGAP. We did Title IV eligibility cleanup, okay? And so I talked about earlier how we were supposed to be checking all these boxes, dotting our I's, crossing our T's to ensure kids were 4E eligible. And some of that historical knowledge has left us, right? And so we've done a lot of work with our community-based care agencies in order to ensure that their eligibility staff have been trained properly on Title IV eligibility. And we've done some work in cleaning up our statewide CWIS system, which was FISFIN, right? And so this program or this initiative is intended to ensure that we don't lose money, right? So it doesn't make sense for the state to pull down all of this money, right? Because we're creating these new programs, but then on the back end, because we're not claiming 4E money properly, we have to pay it back. Right? So once we go off the waiver, the federal government has the ability to come in and audit us on any 4E claim during a certain review period. If they find that we were claiming improperly for a child that didn't have all the correct documentation, they have the ability to request that that money be refunded to them because the child was not 4E eligible and should not receive that funding. So that's why it's imperative to us as a state to make sure if we're claiming it and we're keeping it. And so that's what that program is intended to help us do. Last but not least, we will have Candidacy. Candidacy will be coming out soon. It's intended to serve our very high-risk families, safe, very high risk, and our in-home cases starting off. Our hope and what I've gotten from my leadership is that you shouldn't see a lot of changes in our practice, our child welfare practice. But what you'll see is that we will go around the state and do some enhanced trainings because our safety plans, things of that nature will be used to pull down documentation to claim this money, all right? So the next slide I have really quickly just kind of shows you the breakdown of what we're expected to pull in when it comes to these programs. And so the intent behind all the programs, or high level, was that move to a Title IV program, pull down federal money to fund the program, and then free up our state money, right, to close that $90 million gap. And so, for example, guardianship assistance is probably one of the easiest ones, right? Guardianship assistance program right now is intended, hopefully one day, to replace the relative and the non-relative caregiver program. The relative and the non-relative caregiver program uses TANF dollars and it uses state revenue to fund the benefits to our families. The Guardianship Assistance Program will use Title IV money to support benefits to our families. And so our hope is that we will be able to take that TANF money, take that state general revenue money, use it to close that $90 million gap, and then take the actual federal money to support our families with enhanced benefits. Okay, so let's go ahead and go in and talk about the Guardianship Assistance Program, because that's the program that is set to go live July 1st of this year. So I keep telling everyone I am on my official almost 30-day countdown. You will see that there's a lot of trainings going on across the state. Our CBCs are getting prepared. We are trying to spread the word as much as possible in every avenue that we have a new program that's available to families that is better than our current relative and the non-relative caregiver program. And so we'll talk about, actually there are two programs, and we'll talk about exactly what those are. So first and foremost, I know the rumor has been out for a while that the state of Florida is moving to a model where we require relatives to get licensed for placement. Okay, I am here from the Office of Child Welfare to let everyone know, and you can go back and say, Courtney said that is not true. Okay, it is not a requirement in the state of Florida for placement for a relative to get licensed. Okay, relatives can get placed just like they do right now. Home study, right? Background checks approved, and then we place our child. That has not changed, okay? What has changed is that once the child is placed, we have a new program that will provide an enhanced level of benefits to families that is better than what you currently get with your relative and non-relative caregiver program, and that is licensure. We have created a new licensure for our relatives, non-relatives, fictive kin that are called our level 1 families. Okay, and I'll talk about our new levels of care in a second. And so from licensure, what I always tell everyone, licensure is its own program. Okay, we will have tons of families like we do today. We have tons of relatives who take children into their home, right? But then at some point, they go home. They get reunified, right? And so a lot of our families will never see the Guardianship Assistance Program because our hope is that when their case is open, we will place them like we already do, right? And then we will license them as level 1 foster parents, okay? I also want to make sure that we're very clear that how we think about permanency in the state of Florida hasn't changed, okay? When we place a kid with a relative, our first goal and priority, unless there is some emergency or expedited situation, is to always reunify that child with their parents. That's not changed. But if for some reason it's not in the child's best interest, right, to go home to their parents, to their family, biological family, then our second permanency option will always be what? Somebody say it loud and proud. Adoptions, okay? We will always promote adoptions. And so on everything you see moving forward, our CBCs have been told that anytime you talk about the Guardianship Assistance Program, talk about adoptions first, because we want our children adopted, right? But if we can't get them adopted, we can't send them home, and we realize that closing them out and permanent guardianship isn't the best option for them, then we start to talk about the Guardianship Assistance Program. And so there's a lot of confusion across the state that kids can get this new GAP program as soon as they're placed. No, right? When children are placed, they have the option, the family, to be licensed, okay? And then after licensure, if we get to the point of permanent guardianship, then we start to talk about GAP, because that's how you would close out your case in permanent guardianship, right? And so we kind of give those stages so we can make sure that everyone's clear, because there's, like I said, a lot of misconception about GAP and licensure. I tell everyone it's kind of like two separate programs, but you need one for the other. So I always kind of compare it to our CPIs and case managers, right? All of our cases come through our CPIs, okay? All of our families that will be eligible for GAP will come through licensure. But they will end up with a new set of folks that work with them. They will end up in a new program. They will end up potentially, if we deem them not to be safe, right, working with case management. Two separate programs, right? And so licensure, level 1 licensure, and the Guardianship Assistance Program is that. Two completely separate programs. So let's talk about level 1 licensure. That's been the hot topic on everyone's mind recently. So because we are transitioning to the Guardianship Assistance Program, getting families eligible, we had to change our structure for licensing. And so now we no longer have traditional foster parents, okay? We have what you would call level 2s. So our levels of licensure are based on the actual work that the family has done, and it gives them the type of license and the type of children they can take in their home, okay? So as you can see, our level 1s are our child-specific. So level 1s give you the ability to waive non-safety items. We'll talk about that a little bit more on the next slide, but they have to meet all the safety requirements, okay? The level 1s take in children who are already placed in their home, okay? So they're licensed for children that are already placed in their home. So grandmother could be a level 1 licensed foster parent, right? And we'll talk about what makes them a little bit different. Level 2 is what you know of today or have known of as your traditional foster parents. They still got to do the 21 hours of pre-service. All the requirements for them are still the same. And they have to meet all of those in order to take children in their home that they do not know. So the difference in a level 1 is that the child was already placed prior to us actually even speaking to them about licensure. A level 2, they got licensed before they knew any children. Does that make sense? Okay. Level 3 is what we would call our safe foster homes for victims of human trafficking. Already have those homes, but now their title is level 3. And so they have to meet the requirements of a level 2 and then meet the requirements in 409-1678. Level 4 is what we used to know as therapeutic. So they have to meet the requirements of the level 2s, and they have to meet the requirements identified by ACA to be deemed as a therapeutic foster home. And then last but not least are our CMS families, which are our level 5s. And so those medical foster homes are the foster homes who actually did the requirements of a level 2, and then they went to ACA and CMS and got their certification to be considered a medical foster home, okay? So we have new levels of licensure. When you hear CBC talking about a level 1, you'll know what they mean. A level 2, you know what they mean, okay? So let's talk about level 1s, because as you can see, while the names change, level 2 through 5 is what we know today. Those are our foster parents that we know of today. But our level 1s are very different, okay? Very different. First and foremost, level 1s are designed, and we just talked about this, for relative, non-relative, and fictive kin who have already an established relationship, placement of the child prior to licensing them, okay? In addition, they have to meet all the safety requirements that are found in 65C13 and Florida Statute 409-175. And then under, what makes them very unique is that the department with the FCC got together and made a list of licensing standards that we felt were considered to be non-safety related items. Those non-safety related items, CBCs have the ability to waive those for level 1 foster parents. So let me give you it's not an actual safety requirement, but the thought process of the waivable items. For those that know about foster care licensing, it's very black and white, right? You have and meet these requirements and we can license you. There's no assessing to see, well, you can't quite meet it, but the family is still an excellent candidate to foster children. No, you meet it or you don't for level 2 through 5. So for level 1, the example I like to give is that we have a requirement that you have to have so many doors and windows in every room of the house so that a family can be licensed, right? But we all know that we have relatives out there that have those apartments, right, where it doesn't necessarily have a full-fledged door, right? Or they have a makeshift closet that they've made for our kids, but they've got a bed in the room for the child, a dresser for the child, and they say they're working on making better arrangements, right? And so for level 2 through 5, we wouldn't be able to license them. Under level 1, you would have the ability to waive it based off of a safety assessment for the child, okay? Another example I like to give is, this is an actual, like, for real standard. We have a standard that you have to have a home working phone in every foster parent's house. Nobody has house phones today, right? A lot of our relatives have cell phones, and sometimes our relatives' cell phones are off, right? And so if they were trying to be licensed as a level 2 through 5 right now, we would have to deny them because they don't have a home working phone. Right? With our level 1 licensure, those relatives, non-relatives, and fictive kin who already know the child, already have the child placed in their home, have the ability to have that waived if they have some means to contact individuals in emergency situations. Right? So while you don't have, while you don't have a home phone, you may have a next door neighbor who said, anytime Miss Smith needs to use my phone, she's more than welcome to come over. And you have a free phone that you receive through public assistance, or you have a phone that's not working because, as we know, all phones that you have, whether they have phone service or not, have the ability to call 911 and emergency contacts, right? And that's the true need for our families when we've already got a kid placed in that home. And so those families, after assessing to ensure they do have a mechanism to make contact, have the ability to have that item waived. Okay, so there's a list of them. We don't have time to go over them all. They are on the Center for Child Welfare's website under our new licensing requirements. Yes, ma'am. So actually the CBC doesn't get to waive. They make waiver suggestions to the department. And so the department, just like we license, the Department of Children and Families is the licensing entity for all license. CBCs do the work, they do it attestation, but the final licensure comes from the department and the final approval of the waiver comes from the department. Yep, so it's that same process. So we didn't change from the process. Just like a foster parent, a CBC would submit an attestation packet to the department for approval. For our level ones, they'll submit the packet and they'll submit any waiver requests to the department for approval. Okay, but we have talked to our CBCs about, and our regional licensing staff about, if the kid is there, we've already deemed them safe. And so our goal is to license as many relatives and non-relatives as we can because it's the best benefit for them moving forward. Okay? Any more questions? Very good question. Yes, ma'am.
Kids living in the home for 6 months, if it's licensed, that count as 6 months residing in foster care and then eligible in some situations for PES?
So it depends. So we'll get to it because if the kid closed out in permanent guardianship and yes, they did their 6 months in care, they would be eligible for EGAP and PES. So it depends more on how the case closes out. But yes, there is that potential in certain circumstances for those children to be eligible for PES and EGAP, which is the extension of the Guardianship Assistance Program. Okay? Yes, ma'am. Someone was in the back. They just wouldn't qualify for the benefit. Unless though, now right, so we may do a safety when we're doing our assessment, very rare circumstance, we found something that we did not find in that emergency placement home study, okay? And so at that point, we would do a reassessment, right? But then case management would step in and the reasons we would move a child right now out of a placement are the same reasons. So it necessarily wouldn't be a licensure reason why we would move a child, is that during the licensure process, we found a safety concern that we needed to address immediately that would cause us to move the child. Does that make sense? Okay. I think there was a question over here. Did we get it answered? No? Okay, yes ma'am.
So TANF won't be the backup plan, TANF will be gone?
So no, TANF will not be gone, but the thought process is that over the years, TANF will get smaller and smaller and smaller into this program until it eliminates itself. But it will still always be there potentially for those families. They can go to the relative caregiver. Yes, ma'am. Correct. Yes, ma'am. So her question was if they don't qualify. And so let me say, with our changes in Florida statute that hopefully are getting signed by the governor in the next day or so, hopefully, fingers crossed, we shouldn't have a lot of families that shouldn't qualify. They should be able to make it in the program because in our our legislative package, we adjusted the background check requirements for our level ones. And so now they have to meet the same requirements in order to be placed, in order to get licensed. So if I can't license them because of background checks, I should have never put them in the home, right? Because they would have had to meet those same requirements for placement just to get the child in the home before we talked about licensure. Yes, and so in those situations, a judge would then, if you placed outside of the department's approval, would exclude the family not only from being in a level 1 licensed placement, but the Guardianship Assistance Program, and their only option will be the Relative Caregiver Program. Yes, ma'am. Okay. Yes, in the back, and then I have you. Okay, thank you. So we'll get to that. Give me 1 second to get, but no, there should not be a holding period. But we'll talk about the payments in a few seconds. Yes, ma'am.
It kind of goes along with that. Right now we have the CDCs and the case managers, once the adjudication is done, and the family qualifies for relative caregiver, that assist the family getting it set up, and there's a lot of delays, not all.
Right. So this program is designed to be faster than that program.
And will the licensing agencies be doing this, or will it still be on?
Okay. So each CBC is different. Right, each CBC's got to set it up the way that they feel is best for their community. What I've gotten from most CBCs is that they are having new licensing teams. They're calling them caregiver supports. We've got some relative care supports, kinship support staff, that they are creating new teams with the sole purpose of getting level ones, getting families licensed as a level 1 and supporting them throughout the case. So we'll talk about benefits to the program of being licensed, and that's one of the big new benefits is that relatives will now have a dedicated person, right? Case management's goal, I tell everybody, and so we won't really talk about it when we get to that slide. Case management's goal is to focus on the child, biological family, and things that are surrounding the child. So they help the family because the child has a need, right? Licensing staff do that same level of supporting the licensed foster parent, but our relatives right now, they had nobody. They did not have that support that they needed to have somebody in their corner to say, this is what's in the best interest of the relative, the non-relative, the fictive kin. They didn't have that person that could sit down and take the time to go over all of the requirements of signing up for Medicaid or going to the school to talk to the teacher. They didn't have that type of support. They will have a level of that moving forward, okay? So that's one of the benefits of being licensed. So we talked about non-safety items. And then we talked about you have to know, so the license is only for the child that's placed in your home. So if you have another child that enters your home after your license for Johnny, we've got to do a little update so that we can add Susie to your license. So it's truly child specific. Yes, ma'am.
If you want to go from a level 1 and you address the child and you realize that you have a calling for that, can you go to level?
Yes, ma'am. You can go to a 2, 3, 4, 5. So to be a level 1, you have a lot of requirements that are part of level 2. And so to be a level 2, so if you say I'm licensed as a level 1, you only do the differences. So we'll talk about some of the requirements. So for example, level 1 licensed families only do 4 hours of educational resources. And so educational resources are replacing what we know as parent preparation training. Right? So our level 2 through 5s do 21 hours, okay? And so if you got licensed as a level 1 and you did your 4, you would only have to do the 16? Is that it? 17? 17? Not math, social work, right? The 17 hours difference to become a level 2, okay? All right, so as you can see here, okay, monthly board payment. So what do our licensed foster parents get? They get a monthly board payment. And so our monthly board payments for our level 1s are $333. Okay? And so that should already send out some red flags, some ding ding dings, because what is it? That rate is higher than any rate in the relative or the non-relative caregiver program. Right off the gate. Okay? So let's go into really quickly. What time do we end today? 3:45? Okay, so we got 45 minutes. Let's talk really quick about our types of individuals that can be a level 1. You guys know what a relative is. We know what that definition is. We know what the definition of a non-relative, but we have a new definition in the state of Florida called fictive kin, okay? Fictive kin are those individuals who are not related by blood or marriage, right? But the family and the child consider each to be family. The individual and the child consider each to be family. So the example I like to give is a godparent, right? I'm Gotti. That's what my baby calls me, Gotti. And if you were to ask her and ask anybody, I am her second mother, right? I do for her. I would take her in and do anything she needs me to do because she is my family. And because of that, we are considered fictive kin in the state of Florida, okay? A non-relative will be an individual who knows the child, but doesn't necessarily consider them to be family at this point. So we may have some teachers out there who had Johnny in their class last year. They know of Johnny, they heard about Johnny's situation, and they want to see if they could take placement of Johnny in their home. But at this point, they don't quite consider Johnny to be family. So we place with that individual as a non-relative. But once you keep a child in your home for 6 months, and you go through all of the stuff that is required in the dependency process, that is your family, right? And so why that's important is when we get to the Guardianship Assistance Program, only fictive kin and relatives are eligible for GAP. But we don't see that it'll be an issue because anyone that is placing a child or has a child in their care for 6 months, that's family. And so we've trained our staff on how to assess for fictive kin, so you'll see that terminology used throughout the state, okay? Any questions about fictive kin? Okay, you got one, it's okay. All right, so let's talk about really quick relative caregiver benefits. This is a breakdown on the benefits and the differences kind of in between the two to kind of show folks and individuals that, hey, this in the department and the CBC's just kind of talking. This program truly does provide an enhanced level of services to our families. So the time frames. So back to your comment about our time frames for the relative non-relative caregiver program and adjudication. So what we've seen and some data that we gotten, it was a couple of years ago, was that it's taken us on average 60 to 90 days statewide to get a child adjudicated dependent. Sometimes a lot longer, some areas a lot quicker, okay? And so we all know that in order to be eligible for the relative caregiver program or non-relative caregiver program, you got to have that adjudication. And then from that point, they got to do an application, it's got to get to access, and so it's taking more time. CBCs, per policy, have been instructed that a child and a family should be licensed 60 days from agency notification. They're supposed to be notified, okay, 2 business days from placement of a CPI or case manager. So if you got emergency placement, a CPI has 2 business days to contact the licensing agency and say, hey, Johnny is placed with his aunt, somebody go talk to them about licensure, okay? So that means we can get a family licensed, that's the plan, in 62 days, okay? At the point you're licensed, your payments go back to that point. So if it takes us a month and a half to process you, we go back to the date that we issued you your license. Okay? That's when your payments would start. So the goal is, the thought is, we can get you a higher benefit faster if you get licensed versus going through the relative and the non-relative caregiver program. Okay? There's another misconception there about home studies, right? And so we wanted to clear that up, that every relative will get 2 home studies, whether they go through the licensing process or not. Okay? Give me 1 second and then I'll grab your question. One, if you don't go through the licensing process, the normal process right now is that a child gets an emergency placement home study to get placed, right? You got to get a home study to get in the home. And then 45 days after case transfer, case management should be going back out to that relative's home to do an updated relative home study or non-relative home study on the family. That's the current process, okay? Across the state. That's in CFOP, and all of our CBCs should be doing it in our case management agencies. So for licensure, the process will be, you'll have that emergency placement home study for placement, but instead of having that secondary case management home study, you'll just now have a licensing home study, right? So you will still get 2 home studies, no matter if you go down the licensing program route or not. So that's not additional work for the family. It shouldn't be anything different than what our relatives experience now. Non-relatives, relatives, and fictive kin, okay? Yes, ma'am. Approved.
So what I quite often see is the application process taking months and months
For foster parent licensing?
non-relative
So this program's different, remember? That's the benefit in being licensed is the process for the non-relative caregiver program is that you got to go to Access, you got to do another application, they've got to process your payments. To be a level 1 licensed foster parent, you do all of your stuff from the home study, the CBC sends it to the region for DCF for approval, and it's approved. So that's part of the benefit in being licensed is that being licensed should cut down that time lag that families see when they're applying for the relative and the non-relative caregiver program because we know it's there. Well, it's supposed to replace it with a better program. So families can't get both. You can't get relative caregiver benefits and become licensed. You got to pick or choose. And so we're saying pick the new better program, the new shinier model, because I can get you money faster versus you waiting to take that time to go through that process for the relative caregiver program. And it's more money. It's more money. Yeah, that's the big benefit too. It's more money. Yes, ma'am. They do. It shouldn't. So we haven't got there yet, but it's educational resources. And so it's designed to give them what we hear our relatives talk about all the time, right? They don't know what guardian ad litems are until a guardian ad litem comes out to the house, and then they're like, why is this person coming out to my door, right? Right? You get that all the time. And it's because case managers have tons of things to do, CPIs, and while they'll say to them, a guardian ad litem is coming out to your house and they're there to support the child, they don't go into detail of what that means. So this educational resource is designed to do that. It'll explain to them what a case manager is, why it's important to go to court, a little bit about psychotropic medication, trauma, right? What type of trauma you may experience, the child may have experienced, and how that can affect you. But it's designed to be an online course that the family can do anywhere, right? So they can do it sitting at home on a Saturday in the comfort of their house in segments, okay? That training is expected to go out July 1. But like I said, it's educational resources, because it's not training, it's educational resources. And it's intended, like I said, to be an online support to families. It has links about if you got questions about Medicaid, here's a link to who you go to, right? If you're wondering about things in our education system, here's a link about where you can go to. If you want more information on water safety and psychotropic medication, here's a quick link that you can go to. So it's really intended to give them that support, but it's intended that they should be able to do it in a day or two. If they take the time to do it 2 hours on Saturday and 2 hours on Sunday, they're done. And so we've told our CBCs, each module, they can take a screenshot, right, of the certificate of completion and just email that, text it to your CBC, and that's all you need. Okay? So we're trying to make it as family friendly as possible. In addition, we've told the CBCs that they need to think about potentially setting up rooms at their CBCs for families who don't have internet or may not have a computer, and make it family friendly, because guess what's different between them and our current foster parents, our level 2s? They already have kids in their home. So it's not going to be as easy for them to get to, right, locations and facilities to do this type of training. And so if they can't do it at home for some reason, make it as comfortable as possible for them if it has to be at your facility. But it is an online training, okay? Yes, I thought I had another question. Yes, ma'am, and then over here.
I think you just kind of answered that, but there's nothing on paper for families who don't have Wi-Fi or don't grandparents or great-grandparents.
So either they're going to do it with their, so we've also always told CBCs that it may be that the case manager and, the licensing staff may have to go out to the home and do a face-to-face training, or help them get to an office, but there's no written material. We wouldn't want to give a family 4 hours of written material to read. So either they come to get that information from our agency or they do it online. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, okay. So either they do it online or they come to the agency and the agency will help them get to an internet and get them to Wi-Fi so that they can get to the actual documentation. Yes, ma'am. Correct.
To get the level 1 foster, you can get that much sooner than adjudication if you can get your licensure.
Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. Absolutely. One of the benefits is of being a level 1, you don't have to wait on the court system, right? Because sometimes, because of the magnitude of court cases we have, right, there just may be a scheduling issue where the judge has no choice but to set you out another 45 days so you can have your adjudication hearing, right? And that's not at any fault of anybody, it's just the nature of the amount of work that we have in our system. You don't have that external process that weighs on licensure. It's all internal. Once we get them licensed, the kid is already placed, they get paid from that date that that license was issued, okay? Child support. So we talked about the rate, so I'll talk about that really quick. We talked about the rate, I'll talk about it really quick. As you can see, 333 moving forward, right? 333 no matter what age they are. So if you got a 2-year-old, 333. If you got a 16-year-old, 333. Where the relative non-relative caregiver program is based on age. So it's 242 from 0 to 6, 249 from 6 to 13, and 298 from 13 to 17. So for our folks that have a 2-year-old, it's a higher benefit faster, but everyone gets an increased amount every month, okay? Child support, this is the big one. Most of our relatives don't apply for the relative and non-relative caregiver program because in order to be eligible, you have to comply with child support to the point where DOR, Department of Revenue, and Access Office have a no-touch system, and they notify them when families aren't compliant so that they can terminate them from the relative or suspend their payments, okay? So what I like to tell folks is every child in out-of-home care, child support is enforced on, period. Doesn't matter, okay? Whether you are relative in the relative caregiver program or not. If you're not in the relative caregiver program, it is the department and the CBC's responsibility to comply with child support, okay? If the kid is in out-of-home care. And so for our kids who are in level 1 licensed care, relatives, non-relatives, and fictive kin will not have to comply with child support in order to be eligible for licensure and get their board payment. The department will do all that work, just like we do now, okay? Just like we do now with those families. So even when a family doesn't opt into the relative or non-relative caregiver program, we still at the department file paperwork to support child support on that biological family. That process will not change. What is great is that now relatives have the ability to stay out of it because a lot of our relatives don't want to be that individual that requires their daughter, their granddaughter, their sister, their brother to actually pay child support, okay? So this is a huge benefit of being licensed. We talked about the educational support, additional resources. Our CBCs are currently working on this. Across the state. So each area has local benefits that they provide to caregivers that are licensed. And so the CBCs are looking at what benefits they will be able to offer their families, okay? For example, the number one benefit everyone is looking into right now is that at some CBCs, okay, the $300 clothing allowance will apply to level 1s, which is going to be huge. Okay? Once again, CBCs have the ability to look at their policies to see if they will be able to pick that service up. It is not a state requirement that everyone get that $300 clothing allowance, but if your CBC is one that decides to offer that level of benefit to your families, your level 1s, then they would be able to be eligible. We've got a couple. I'm not going to announce them right yet. I'm going to let them announce it in their community that have already said, Courtney, what our level 2 through 5s get, our level 1s are going to get too. And that's awesome. But we do have some CBCs that said, well, we may not be able to provide a 300, but now we're getting ready to set up a clothing closet where we will have something accessible to relatives and non-relatives that we didn't have before that are licensed. Okay? So they're all looking at what additional supports they can provide families that get licensed that will not be available to families who are just in the relative and the non-relative caregiver program. Okay? Case management, we kind of talked about that, how now relatives will have that licensed person, right? that they don't have now that is there to support them. And then this goes back to that time delay. Relative caregiver program, non-relative caregiver program is completed through access, so they got to go to another agency to make another application. They got to wait on the time frame to get that application completed. Licensing is done through their local CBC, who they should already have contact with. They should already have some relationship, which would hopefully cut out some of the time. Okay? Yes, ma'am.
Is there going to be literature that will be handed out to potential?
So yes, so the department is working on doing some literature to current caregivers, certain caregivers, to let them know about the program. The CBCs, so we actually even created a brochure for our CPIs and frontline case managers to kind of say, hey, thank you, one, for being a relative caregiver, a lot of support out there for you. Here's some high-level supports that you have. Somebody will be out to talk to you. Once again, it's now moving forward, July 1, a requirement that every kid placed with a relative, non-relative, or fictive kin, someone from their licensing program is going to talk to them about benefits within 2 days of placement. That is the new requirement moving forward, July 1. But then on top of that, the CBCs have created their own brochures to give out to families. So we've got a lot of literature that's out there that is going to be going live July 1 in regards to level 1 licensure. In addition, we have all this information on the Center for Child Welfare's website. Okay? All right, so we get you licensed, right? And as you can see, in order to be licensed, we'll talk about that, you have to meet some criteria. Now let's talk about GAP. We've got about 20 minutes to talk about the Guardianship Assistance Program. So family gets licensed, enjoying the benefits of being a licensed level 1 foster parent. We're working our case just like we regularly do, right? We're doing our safety plan, case plan updates, working with the biological family to try to get the conditions for return met so that we can reunify. But for some reason, that doesn't work out. It's not in the child's best interest, right? Then we go through the adoption process. We try to locate the family says they're not interested. We look for adopting other families to adopt. We work with the family on adopting, trying to make them understand the importance of adoption, how it should be, and is our secondary permanency goal, because it is true permanency. It creates a new family for the child in care versus our permanent guardianship. While it's long term, it can be changed, right? Families still will have the ability, when you close out in permanent guardianship, to petition the court to reopen their cases to get their children back, right? So changes. So we'll talk to families about permanency, talk to them about adoptions, work very hard, right, to get that child adopted. But then we see, for some strange reason, that's not going to work either. Not in the child's best interest to be adopted. And we start having the conversations about permanent guardianship. The first thing we're going to look to do to see, was the family licensed, okay? And if they were, we'll talk about what the benefits are and what the criteria for GAP is. But then let's just do a real quick overview of GAP. So the Guardianship Assistance Program, 4E program, that's intended to serve families who close out their cases in permanent guardianship. Okay? Open case, level 1 licensed foster parent, board payment. Closed case, Guardianship Assistance Program. Okay? You got to make sure, so one of the federal requirements for the Guardianship Assistance Program is that we have to legally document why this child should not be reunified and this child should not close out in adoption, okay? Already our state process, right? So that shouldn't be anything new for us as a state, and so it was easy for us to pick that up as the federal requirement. The other thing associated with the Adoption Assistance Program is that, once again, it is a benefit for those families who close out in permanent guardianship. Got to close out in permanent guardianship, okay? All right, so the benefits are paid to the guardian, relative, or the fictive kin on behalf of the child. You get the payments until the child turns 18, unless they're in the extension of GAP. Just like the extension of MAS, there's an extension of GAP program as well. And this is not different, because for the relative and non-relative caregiver program, you have ongoing annual redeterminations. We know that, right? All our families have to send something to Access every year to stay eligible once our case closes out, and even when the case is open. That is a requirement now for the Relative Non-Relative Caregiver Program. Once you're in GAP, you no longer have to be licensed because your case is closed, right? But you do an annual redetermination with your CBC. It's a document that you need to fill out, submit back to the CBC saying that you still have the child in your care and you still would like to receive the benefit. Very simple form that our relatives and fictive kin will complete. But it's done on a yearly basis, just like they would do if they were getting the relative caregiver benefit. Okay? So let's talk about eligibility. So we talked about you have to close out in permanent guardianship pursuant to Florida statute. And so here's where licensure starts to come into play, okay? To be eligible for the Guardianship Assistance Program, the guardian had to be licensed to care for the child that they're closing out in permanent guardianship, and the child would have had to be eligible to receive 6 months of foster care board payments, okay? So there are a lot of moving pieces when you talk about that, right? 6 months. Why does that 6-month number sound familiar to us in the state of Florida? Right. So we have a statute, state requirement that a child has to be placed in the home with a caregiver 6 months before we can even close out permanent guardianship, right? And so that's why it's imperative, and our CBCs know you got to get them licensed as soon as possible, because the requirement for GAP doesn't start until they actually become eligible for a foster care board payment, okay? And so that does give us a 2-month time difference, right? So you can have a kid placed for 6 months, but for licensure, the family would probably only be at the 4-month mark, right? But what we've seen in our data is that most judges and most cases don't close out at 6 months, because we're still giving families, right, biological parents, time to reunify, and so that should not be a problem. But it is imperative, and we train our CBCs 60 days to get them licensed, okay? But they do have to do 6 months of consecutive. So that's the other big thing. It has to be consecutive, okay? Some of our CBCs are looking at whether or not they'll provide respite, just like we do for 2 through 5s. Will they be able to provide respite? So that's an additional service. But if that CBC doesn't provide respite and the caregiver says, I can't do this anymore, come get the child, move them into a group home for 2 nights, and then you place them back, your 6 months start over, okay? So it is very, 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 very important, and the CBCs, that's why they created these new teams that are designed to support the caregiver. They're gonna be there to support them, because we know that we've got to keep that child placed in the home to keep that family eligible to receive that board payment. Because if you don't have the kid, you're no longer eligible for the board payment. Now there are some circumstances, right? So if the kid goes to the hospital, that doesn't count. It's when the federal government has a list of what they consider to be placement moves, when a child makes a placement move that is defined by the federal government, okay? Any questions about that? Right? So in addition to the 6 months, it's kind of oxymoron that the last eligibility criteria to be eligible for the Guardianship Assistance Program is that you close out in permanent guardianship. But in order to also be eligible, prior to closing out in permanent guardianship, you have to complete a guardianship assistance agreement. How many folks have heard about adoption assistance agreements? For adoptions? Yes, no? Do we know about those? Nope. Okay. So the Guardianship Assistance Agreement is just like the Adoption Assistance Agreement. It's just for guardians. So on it, the CBCs and the guardian will identify how much we'll pay them every month when the case closes. We'll tell them they're still eligible for Medicaid. They sign it and we sign it saying this is how much they get every month. That has to be done before the case closes. And so for our attorneys, for our guardian ad litems, for our judges, when we get to permanent guardianship, a lot of times what we see is that permanent guardianship happens fast, right? We'll get to court, we'll be doing a JR, we'll realize we've met the 6 months, mom and dad have not been doing their case plan, and we'll just close out permanent guardianship that day. That cannot happen moving forward, because if it does, you automatically eliminate this family from the Guardianship Assistance Program, okay? In addition to having your GAA completed before your case closes, there are some permanent guardianship case plan requirements that have to be filed with the court. So we have got to move forward as a state that we don't let cases close out in permanent guardianship unless that permanent guardianship case plan has been filed and that guardianship assistance agreement has been completed. Okay? So we're going to have to, guardian ad litems, attorneys, advocate so that our judges know, hey, Your Honor, give us 2-3 weeks to get this put together for this family so that when we have it all together, we can make them eligible for the Guardianship Assistance Program. Because if they close before we get to that point, family, even though they've done all that work, automatically ineligible. And there's no way to go back and fix it. A judge's order can eliminate them from the program. Okay. Case plan filed with all the case plan requirements, and so CLS is aware of what those case plan requirements are, and they'll make sure that that's in there. The guardianship assistance agreement. Those two things have to be done in conjunction with ensuring that the family has their 6 months, right, of consecutive payments. But those are the things that we're concerned about will pop up, right? Because the family could have their 6 months of consecutive payments, but we've not gotten to their guardianship assistance agreement yet. Judge will be ready to close because they've met all of the statute compliance. We've got to make sure we get that in before they close their case.
Well, it's not 6 months placement, it's 6 months payments.
Yes, ma'am. 6 months payments. Eligibility for payments. And so you can't be eligible for payments until you get licensed. And so why I make that distinction is that families that get SSI won't get a payment, but they'll be eligible for payments and still be eligible for GAP. Because we want them to take advantage of the SSI, right? More money, and we want families to get the best benefit option available. Yes, but they will be available to all the other benefits from the CBC, just not the monthly board payment, those SSI families. Yes.
Permanent guardianships are always open to reopening if their situations change, like if parents come in. So if you screw up and close the case because you don't know about this stuff, but then reopen the case.
So the only way you can reopen the case, so what has to happen, because it's a federal requirement, we're a federal 4E program, is that the family has to prove they had no knowledge about the Guardianship Assistance Program. Well, if CLS says, Your Honor, we need 30 days to do the GAA, that's all the notice we had to give the family. It is on record that we were trying to help the family. So when the family goes back to petition the department to reevaluate the eligibility, they'll be denied because they knew about the service prior to case closure. So if you know about it, so it only applies when the family can prove that they had absolutely no idea if the program existed. Now remember, I don't think I even mentioned it, not only do we plan at the department with our CBCs to talk about the Guardianship Assistance Program once we get closer, when we have a family that says no, case management will be going out when they do their monthly home visit. Case management will be talking to the family every month about, are you sure you don't want to be licensed? It sets you up for the Guardianship Assistance Program and it gives you a higher level benefit. So our plan is to talk to the family about it every month of the case until we either send the kid home, reunify, send the kid home, adopt the kid, or close out permanent guardianship. So we don't foresee a lot of families being able to say, hey, we didn't know anything about the program, okay? And we have a form that we're wanting them to fill out that says you understand that you're deciding not to be licensed at this time, because what we don't want, right, is families who we've told about it, and then we get time to close in permanency with the kid. The kid's been open for, 2 years, a year and a half, and now they decide to be licensed. Because at that point, you got to do almost another 8 or 9 months to get them eligible for GAP. And that probably at that point is not in that child's best interest. So we're going to work with families every month to make sure that from the beginning we can show the judges, the court system, that we did our due diligence to educate on the benefit of this program, and that family said no. And so once again, why it's important for us to be here with the Guardian Litems, you guys can also do that work with us. Every month, you need to get licensed. Please get licensed. We'll work with you. It is truly the best benefit option for our relatives, non-relatives, and fictive kin. There was another question, I think, somewhere. Yes, sir.
When is that process going to start?
July 1.
Who's in charge of doing that?
What do you mean? In charge of what?
Community care providers, or someone from the department? Who's in charge of ultimately making sure that happens?
What happens? What part?
Talking to
CPIs do it at initial placement. Then licensing staff are required 2 days from placement to go and talk to the families about licensure and gap. So every family gets it then. And then if the family says no to our licensing staff at that 2-day mark, then case management every month at their monthly home visit are to talk to families about licensure and gap.
Who's the employer of the people that come out 2 days later? Is that the state or is that the
CBCs. So the only state employed individuals would be your PIs who do and then the actual licensing entities. So the regional licensing staff. Yeah. But it's CBCs. Yes, ma'am.
So the kids that are already in dependency care, who's responsible for notifying those caregivers that this program is starting July 1st?
So we're doing a lot of different efforts because some families it's not in the child's best interest, right? If a family's getting ready to adopt next month, this program doesn't benefit them. So it's not going to be a matter of notifying everyone because everyone is not going to be, it's not going to be in the child's best interest. So the CBCs are making assessments. The department is looking into sending out a mailer to families that we feel potentially may be in a good situation. So those that have already been placed probably in the last couple of months, because those families are still working their case plan. We can get them licensed and get to the 6-month mark. So we have that mailer, hopefully that will be coming out. In addition to the CBCs are making assessments. Some CBCs have already started to call relatives and prioritize them based off of permanency goal. Because once again, we've told folks if adoption is the permanency goal, we're not talking about gap. Because adoption should be the priority for that family if that's the route we're going, right? So it really depends on the family circumstance, but the CBCs are reaching out. Okay? Yes, ma'am.
So in a case that the child has been with a family less than 6 months, because they started being caregiver like say 5.5 months prior, that is they can leave us for the termination of parental rights if the child will go to adoption or reunification or reunification is that the case.
Mm-hmm.
But then we program that at that time, sign the agreement for that, the Guardianship Assistance Program, and extend that previous foster care period for guardianship that they have into this.
No, because you have to close out permanent guardianship. So the scenario that you gave, the case they would make a transition. So you try for reunification. If that fails, you try for adoption. They stay licensed the whole time. So our adoption staff have already been trained to know that a majority of their families now will be licensed foster parents that will be adopting, because you'll either be a level 2 or a level 1. But if all of that fails, if it's 5 months in, our CBCs are going to have to look at what's in the best interest for the child, right? No, so for the state, you got to do 6 months of placement before you can even close out permanent guardianship. So in your 5-month scenario, no, they could not close out, period, because you couldn't close out till you got to 6 months. But if at that 6-month mark, they said no the whole time, and then they came to us at month 6 when it's time to close and said, we're interested, we would look at what's in the best interest of the child, because it may not be in that child's best interest if the parents aren't doing anything on their case plan, we aren't making changes to get to the conditions for return being met, to keep the case open another 8 months. Because essentially a case is going to have to be open for 8 months to be eligible for gap. Does that make sense? 2 months for the licensure, and then 6 months being eligible for a board payment. Okay? Yes?
Could you explain the successor guardian?
Yes, I was getting ready to explain that. I think I got like 2 minutes. Successor guardian is very new, okay? Successor guardian is part of our program where we actually have the ability to name someone on the guardianship assistance agreement that the caregiver identifies that will be able to take the child if something happens to them. And so the if something happens to them isn't I just don't want the child. The horrible scenario that I give folks, the caregiver passes away, right? But even in that, they would have to follow our normal court process. So they got to get a home study, they got to get background checks done. We've got to do 6 months of post-placement supervision with them before we could close their case back out into permanent guardianship. But because that caregiver is on that GAA as a successor guardian, they're automatically eligible for GAP. So they don't have to get licensed, right? So successor guardians are going to be a new thing. I'm getting ready to do some talks with our CLS department about some maybe 2020 language around successor guardians. But the process in reopening cases in the state of Florida has not changed. What it does for the CBCs is it allows us to, one, already have that caregiver identified that we can reach out to say, hey, something has happened to Ms. Smith. Are you willing to take the child in your home? We got to come out and do our home study background checks. But then at that point, we follow the normal court process. And they're automatically eligible for GAP because they are on the actual GAA. Okay? So there's one more slide. I know we run out of time, but if y'all give me like 3 minutes, I want to really show you the benefits because we haven't even got to the benefits of GAP, which is the best part, right? So what's really important up here, 333. So that's the same rate you got as a foster parent, right, as a level 1. So our families shouldn't see a break in service. 1 month open case, level 1 licensed foster parent. Next month, closed case, permanent guardian, in the Guardianship Assistance Program GAP payment. But we'll still send the same 333 to the same bank account if that's what they want. So they don't see a break in services. We just pay it out of a different pot of money. Does that make sense? Medicaid until age 18, and then 21 if you are in the extension of EGAP. Tuition fee exemption, this is big. Doesn't matter how old you are, just like adoptions. If you're eligible for GAP, you get the tuition and fee exemption. So if you're a 2-year-old, you close out, you're eligible for the Guardianship Assistance Program. When you turn 18, you get the tuition fee exemption for your child. Big benefit, okay? One of the hugest benefits is currently with the relative and non-relative caregiver program, if you move out of state, all your benefits stop. You don't get Medicaid, you don't get any money, okay? That's our current program. That's not going to change. Guardianship Assistance Program, money follows you. If the kid is 4E, Medicaid follows you. So you don't have to make a decision. You can take the job in Hawaii, right? You can take the job in Hawaii, right? We will send your money to whatever bank account you tell us to. The money follows you. So that's probably one of the biggest benefits because if you're in the relative, non-relative caregiver program, as soon as you leave the state, we cut you off of everything, okay? Last but not least, they get a $2,000 non-reoccurring expense. So those that know about adoptions, very similar to adoptions, non-reoccurring one-time payment of $1,000. Guardians get $2,000, but we don't anticipate them using it because unlike adoptions, CLS is going to do and close out permanent guardianship cases for us for free. So there shouldn't be a cost associated to the caregiver to close their case in permanent guardianship. The example I like to give really quick about the non-recurring expenses is if you have a hurricane season, right? So we were planning to close out my case in permanent guardianship next week. Hurricane came and blew off my front door. We can't close a case out, right, with the caregiver not having a front door. The CBC, if you're eligible for GAP, can potentially use your non-reoccurring $2,000 expenses to pay to help get you that door so we can close that case out in permanent guardianship, okay? Now, one thing that's really important is this doesn't have anything to do with placement. So if this same scenario happened and we just placed the child and the goal is reunification and we're trying to get them licensed, this non-reoccurring expense does not apply because we're not even talking about permanent guardianship with that family yet, right? We still have to do reunification and adoption. So it's only when we're trying to close a case out, a goal of permanent guardianship has been established, and there's something that the family needs in order to close out in permanent guardianship. So we want to make that really clear. But that's a benefit. Another example I like to give is if you live in North Carolina and the judge orders you to come down to court in Miami for your permanent guardianship case closure, CBCs can use that $2,000 non-reoccurring expenses to help to pay for travel. So those are the type of scenarios, things needed to close out in permanent guardianship. Okay? Yes, ma'am.
Question about the insurance. So it's only until they're 18 or 21 if they're extended, but generally kids that age out of care is at 26.
Yeah, but these kids didn't age out of care. Right. So, but remember, kids who close out in permanent guardianship, that doesn't apply to them now because they didn't age out in care. So the only kids that you're referring to are those kids that at 18, they were in the custody of the department with the open case. Yeah. So that benefit isn't different from GAP to now. Okay? Yes? But what is different is the Medicaid following the kid to Nebraska. Because right now, it wouldn't. That's what the big difference is for GAP. So there are probably a couple more slides that we didn't get to. But there is information on the Center for Child Welfare about the extension of the Guardianship Assistance Program. It's identical to the maintenance adoption subsidy, where if you sign your GAA when the child is 16 or 17, you can extend their GAP payments till 21. So I have a couple slides on that, and then there's some information out there that shows the differences between adoption and guardianship benefits. So if you want to look at that information to know these are the benefits if you adopt, these are the benefits if you close out in GAP, okay? Well, thank you guys. I appreciate it. We had some really good questions. July 1 is our due date. It's our go live date. Spread the word.